is, among other things, the theoretical anchor, really the centerpiece of a series of initiatives that the center I direct, together with a bunch of others, which I'll mention in a minute, have organized under the influence, the spell, whatever you want to call it, of Michael Kennedy, who is now at Brown and who could not join us today. So Michael's original idea was to try and set the 1989 events in East and Central Europe in a larger geographical but also conceptual framework. And so mixing the social scientific insight and numerology, which is always a nice thing, we couldn't but notice that a lot of the big events that we tend to commemorate or regret, whatever the case might be, in recent history have tended to take place at the end of decades, right? So you have the exemplary political revolution of 1789 in France. You have 1919 as the year of widespread, communist and socialist-inspired insurrections across Europe. You have 1929, the year of the crash on Wall Street, and then, of course, with repercussions around the world. 1949 in China, 1959 in Cuba, 1979 in Afghanistan and Iran, and the list, of course, goes on. So, hence the title, The Nines. Brinks, cusps, and perceptions of possibility from 1789 to 2009, which will culminate in a conference at the beginning of December in which several of the people in the audience will participate. And this has been indeed quite a collaborative effort. In addition to CSUC, the organizers include our sister centers, so the Center for Russian and Eastern European Studies, the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, under the aegis of the newly established Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, in collaboration with the Center for Chinese Studies, and in today's case, the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies as well. So if Michael Kennedy was, in a sense, the causa proxima of this venture, the primus movens, the ultimate inspiration of it all, is of course with us today. It's been Bill Sewell that has taught us to think of events in novel and rigorous ways. And indeed, these nines, right, these big events that I mentioned before, for all their diversity, all constituted moments in which political imagination ran wild, moments in which local and global structures fractured, so to speak. People could see through them and realize that they had the possibility to imagine and indeed effect change. So the status quo before, the status quo ante could never be reestablished. Of course, change was irreversible, although in many cases the wild imagining spawned in the heat of political battle, or indeed in the chill of economic despair, whatever the case might be. Many of these wild imaginings grew quite a bit tamer over time. Not in all cases, but some of them. So today we welcome the guy that started it all for us, at least conceptually, so we're really excited that he's here. But before we get to listen to our guest, Professor Ron Suni will tell you a little more about him. I don't think I need to really introduce Ron to this audience. He is a professor in the Department of History. He's also Charles Tilly Collegiate Professor of Social and Political History in the Department of Political Science. He's one of the world's experts in Soviet history, in the history and theories of nationalism. And as of this year, he's also the director of the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies. Ron, last but not least, of course, Ron is also a longtime colleague, friend, and comrade of Bill Sewell's. So it's hard to imagine a better person to introduce today's guest. So please.
I especially like the comrade part, thank you for that. William Sewell Jr. is the Frank P. Hickson Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of History and Political Science at the University of Chicago. But Bill Sewell is really one of us. He was here at Michigan, as many of you remember, as Professor of Sociology and History for 5 years. He's also a son of the Midwest. Born and bred in Wisconsin, he graduated in sociology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. His father was the distinguished sociologist William H. Sewell, who later served as chancellor of that university. Bill went on then to Berkeley for his graduate training, where he worked on French political and social history. Now, in fact, Bill has what looks to me at first glance as a 5-year plan. He was at the University of Chicago, more or less for 5 years, before moving for 5 years to the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton from 1975 to 1980. And then he spent 5 more years at the University of Arizona in Tucson before moving to Michigan in history and sociology for 5 years, 1985 to 1990. This guy simply could not hold a job for very long. And then he finally moved back to the University of Chicago, this time in political science and history, and managed to stay there until his retirement 2 years ago. And those of you who have read the opening autobiographical chapter from Logics of History know, Bill began his career dedicated as a social historian to the promising field of quantitative history. But something happened along the way, as he was assiduously collecting data on workers in Marseille during the French Revolution. The workers were in the French Revolution, not Bill, of course. He was ambushed by culture, discourse, and the historical turn in the social sciences. And really, Bill is, as Daria mentioned, a pioneer in what has been called the cultural turn in history and sociology. As someone deeply interested in social theory, familiar with the currents of French post-structural thinking, he was extraordinarily influential during that difficult passage for many of us from more positivist and fundamentalist Marxist approaches to the rich and dangerous fields of discursive exploration. He was here a founding member of CSST, Comparative Studies in Social Transformations, that seminal seminar that profoundly shaped a generation of faculty and students. Bill's first book, Work and Revolution in France, The Language of Labor from the Old Regime to 1848, which eventually received the Henry Baxter Adams Prize from the American Historical Association, came at just that moment when the whole concept of class was being seriously questioned, and along with a number of important historians in the Marxist tradition, think of E.P. Thompson earlier and Gareth Stedman Jones a few years after Bill, forced a rethinking of the centrality and autonomy of culture and language in shaping consciousness and the imagined community of class. He later wrote A Rhetoric of Bourgeois Revolution, a study of the Abbé Sieyès and the famous pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? And then collaborated in a project at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford with a number of other scholars, a very important edited volume called Silence and Voice in Contentious Politics. But it was the next book, and the one that we'll be discussing tomorrow at our workshop from 12 to 2 in Tisch Hall, Logics of History, Social Theory, and Social Transformation, that really brings us together today and tomorrow. This book won the 2008 Theory Prize for Outstanding Books from the Theory section of the American Sociological Association. So you can see that Bill is able to navigate between departments and disciplines, sociology, history, even political science, with a hearty dose of anthropology along the way. He's one of the very few historians, one thinks of someone like Hayden White, or Joan Scott, or Thompson, who has thought hard and made major contributions to social theory. But he's done it along with serious empirical work as well. And instead of the expected argument that historians need to engage theory, he has also insisted that social theory badly needs a serious infusion of historical habits of mind. Bill exposes what many of us historians might know but have trouble articulating. He foregrounds things that seem so fundamental to our thinking, like event, structure, temporality, and then he subjects them to his own interrogation that I must say is exceptionally clear. That exceptional clarity is what I so treasure in his work, and then helps us understand what he calls the lumpy uneven, unpredictable, and discontinuous qualities of historical temporality. He is confident that dealing with culture in the broadest sense is fundamental to historical thinking, and culture, that humanly constructed practices, conventions, and beliefs that shape all aspects of social life, from agriculture and procreation to poetry and religion, offers not only to historians but to a broader public an openness to both the narratives of the past and to the variety of potential futures offered to us. There's both, in Sewell, change and hope. Past logics differ from present logics and must be discovered by historians, and that opens the possibility of quite novel logics of the future. I want to mention two further honors that Bill has achieved. In 2004, quite extraordinary for a historian, he was named a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and most recently, he was appointed to the Board of Trustees of the Institute for Advanced Studies. Now that's not bad for somebody who 50 years ago was turned down by Harvard University when he applied for admission after high school, the very same year that that august institution accepted Ted Kaczynski. Whatever happened to Ted? Anyway, that aside, Bill's recent project, his ongoing current project, is about the origins of capitalism and the French Revolution, sort of reversing a question that has been thought of in different ways. There must be something about the French Revolution that has to do with capitalism, something about capitalism that has to do with the French Revolution, pace furée. And so today's topic is, in fact, economic crises as transformative events. I give you Bill Sewell.
Thank you very much, Ron, for that wonderful précis of my work. I hope you'll give me a copy so I know what I've accomplished. It also, I think, does a nice job of sort of saying where I've come from. One of the interesting things I think about what I'll be doing in this talk today is that I'm in some ways returning to my very early interests. At Berkeley, I actually majored in graduate school. My major field was actually economic history. And I'm more and more find that I'm engaging with problems of the economy and of economic change, which it seems to me has been left out of too much historical study in recent years, or not taken sufficiently seriously. It was actually in my years at the University of Michigan in the later 1980s that I began to worry about the event as a theoretical category. My active participation, at that time I had a joint appointment in history and sociology. My active participation in the intellectual life of those two departments, and also in the very lively debates of the CSST program, which Ron mentioned. These made me keenly aware that sociologists, even historical sociologists, had conceptions of the temporalities of social life that were very different from those of historians. A key difference was the way they thought about events. Now, it should be said that neither historians nor sociologists at that time had much to say about the event as a theoretical category. But in practice, historians took events very seriously indeed. They usually thought of events as highly contingent happenings that could change the very direction of historical development in a given society. And they spent a lot of time actually working through, analyzing events. Sociologists, by contrast, thought of events mainly as historical consequences, as kind of dependent variables rather than independent variables, to use their terminology. mainly as the historical consequences of long-term, slow-moving structural causes. They rarely paid much attention to the dynamics of events as such. My own theoretical work on events, which culminated in my book Logics of History, which Ron mentioned, might be characterized as an attempt to introduce more of historians' sense of contingency, what I call eventful temporality, into sociological theory, and more of sociologists' explanatory rigor, that is, the logics of history, into historical thought. Since finishing Logics, I've been working mainly on the history of capitalism, to some extent in the post-World War II world, and more particularly in 18th century France. So when Mike Kennedy sweet-talked me into giving a lecture on events shortly before flying the coop for Brown, I decided to focus specifically on capitalist events. Given that Mike's request came in early 2008, economic crises seemed the obvious candidates. Recurrent economic crises are, after all, a form of event peculiarly characteristic of capitalism as a social formation. I had imagined that I would be able to craft a lecture that would speak to the current economic crisis, perhaps putting it in the context of previous economic crises. Particularly, I thought, well, maybe I do 1929, since this is supposed to be out the nines. You'll see there are not very many nines in this lecture, actually. But that isn't the lecture I ended up writing. Instead, what you're about to hear is pretty theoretical in character. Its main goal is to specify the distinctive dynamics of events in that sphere of life that we call the capitalist economy, to try to think clearly about how economic events differ from and are similar to events in other spheres of social life. Although this issue at first blush may seem rather abstruse, I think it's actually of considerable moment in the contemporary world. One of the most important world developments of the past 30 years certainly is the full entry into capitalism of well over 1 billion people who had previously lived in collectivized communist economies. One of the key legacies of 1989, the anniversary that this lecture series is celebrating, was the triumph of capitalism on a global scale. A clear-eyed understanding of capitalism's dynamics seemed to me essential for making sense of the contemporary world. Specifying the distinctive character of economic events also seems important in the context of current historiography. A few decades back, especially over the course of the 1970s and the 1980s, historians turned massively away from studies of economic life, effectively ceding knowledge of this sphere to economists and to economic historians based in economics departments. This has, in my opinion, left the history profession rather disarmed in the present, when the resurgence of an unfettered global capitalism has raised a wide range of historical questions that we seem to me ill-equipped to answer. I hope a lecture that tries to grasp the specific logic of economic events may help to nudge forward a re-engagement of historical thought with the problems of economic life. Let me begin with the most blatant of economic events, that is, economic crises. Interestingly, considering these crises as events actually puts considerable pressure on the event as a theoretical category. Historians, myself included, tend to think of events as unique, as highly contingent happenings that somehow transform or reshape the social world in which they take place, as what we often, in kind of standard historical language, talk about as watersheds or turning points in history. But one of the uncanny features of economic crises is how repetitive they are. At a certain level, they seem to signal not fundamental breaks or turning points in history, but rather a kind of societal level repetition complex, the eternal return of the same fundamental capitalist story of greed and irrational exuberance, followed by panic and the destruction of value. Thus, Charles Kindleberger could write his classic book, Manias, Panics, and Crashes, A History of Financial Crises, whose central argument is that financial crises of the capitalist economy have had essentially the same features all the way back to the tulip mania in 17th century Holland. To be sure, the specific details are always different, but as Kindleberger pithily puts it, details proliferate, structure abides. Kindleberger first wrote his book in 1975. It's now in its 5th printing and is, not surprisingly at this point in history, selling very briskly. Thus, if economic crises are events, they're events of a peculiar sort, events that at a certain level of abstraction have repeated themselves over and over again for some 300 or 400 years. One might say that they mark actually the continued identity of capitalism as a historically existing social system, as much as they power or register transformations of capitalism over time. Yet, it would be ridiculous to deny the importance of economic crises as events, especially at this moment, only 13 months after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and 9 months into the presidency of Barack Obama, who, after all, might not have been elected had the economy not collapsed in the final weeks of the electoral campaign. One very important respect in which economic crises must in the end be counted as events is that they sometimes have very significant political consequences. Rahm Emanuel famously remarked that a politician should never let an economic crisis go to waste. He and Obama are currently laboring to squeeze whatever political advantage they can out of the economic downturn that began in late 2007 and became a full-scale financial crisis in the fall of 2008. But this is certainly not the first economic crisis of the past century to have had major political consequences. The Great Depression of the 1930s spawned the American New Deal in the American context, but also the Nazi seizure of power in Germany, the Spanish Civil War, the victory of the Popular Front in France, and plenty of other important political consequences elsewhere. The long and puzzling economic crisis of the 1970s, with its deindustrialization, stagflation, and high unemployment, was a crucial condition for the victories of both Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the United States, and consequently for the eventual global victory of neoliberalism. But the linkage between economic and political crises goes back much farther than 1933, at least as far back as 1789. Here I'm doing my best to sneak in one of Mike Kennedy's nines. The Great French Revolution of 1789 actually coincided with the worst economic crisis of the 18th century, and it's now generally recognized that the economic crisis was a major source of the intense political mobilization of that year. The crisis was caused primarily by failed harvests, as was often the case, in fact, of economic crises before the Industrial Revolution. The harvest-based economic downturn served as a catalyst for a revolution by two distinct mechanisms. First, the failed harvest sharply raised the price of grain, hence of bread, which constituted the better part of the diet and a good half of the budgets of ordinary people. When prices rose drastically, as they did in the late 1780s, much of the population was rendered chronically hungry and hence extremely ornery. To this was added a crucial indirect effect of high grain prices. When grain prices rose, people also cut back on other purchases so they could buy enough grain to live. And this decline in demand resulted in mass unemployment in the manufacturing sector. If most people were hungry and ornery as a result of the inadequate harvest, urban and rural manufacturing workers were rendered absolutely desperate, facing high bread prices at the same time that they lost their wages. And because they were unemployed, they were also spending a lot more time hanging out in the streets or the village squares where they were available for demonstrations and riots. So if economic crisis helped turn a political crisis into revolution in 1789, history repeated itself on a European scale in 1848, another year of revolution in which there was a severe economic crisis that resulted from a harvest failure. So there's this definite repetition. But the economic crisis set off by the simultaneous failure of the wheat and potato harvests in 1846 and 1847 was the last general harvest-induced economic crisis in Europe. As early as the 1820s, business cycles proper, which were based essentially on fluctuations in investment and demand for industrial goods, quite independently of agricultural conditions, these began to replace harvest rhythms as the main determinant of fluctuations in European economies. Business downturns, no less than bad harvests, produced sharp upswings in unemployment, and therefore had the potential of generating political unrest. For example, the peak periods of agitation of the English Chartist movement in the 1830s and the 1840s were all associated with depressions in trade, as they were then called. Marx and Engels, writing in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, were convinced that this new phenomenon of the business cycle was the fatal flaw that would bring capitalism as a system down. In commercial crises, they said, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity. An epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of demonstration, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. Marx and Engels viewed these periodic economic catastrophes with a certain polemical glee, since they were convinced that ever-worsening crises would eventually lead to a proletarian revolution, which would finally bring capitalism and its debauched cycles of destruction to an end. Now, if they turned out to be wrong about this, their prediction hardly seemed preposterous at the time it was made in 1848, or for that matter, over most of the following century. Indeed, when the Great Depression of the 1930s broke out, it seemed to many to be precisely the long-awaited or long-feared catastrophe that might bring the capitalist era to an end. Over the course of the 1930s, it became clear that capitalism, however battered, would actually survive, and also that economic collapse and the consequent political volatility actually wound up benefiting fascist or authoritarian right more often than it did the far left. The experience of the Great Depression was very much on the minds of the European and American political leaders when they reconstructed their countries after the devastations of World War II. It was largely the recognition of the political dangers posed by mass unemployment that convinced the post-war governments to adopt Keynesian full employment measures and generous unemployment benefits. It's telling that these measures were instituted both by right-of-center and left-center governments, and that down through the 1970s they were maintained and even strengthened over time, whoever was in power. The generalization of such counter-cyclical policies has in fact been quite effective. Their adoption seems to have marked the end of an era in the history of the economic crisis. So crises continued to happen after World War II, but their effects, at least in states sufficiently robust to apply counter-cyclical policies in an effective way, their effects were sufficiently moderated that they no longer threatened the viability of regimes. So in the post-war world, in Europe, the United States, Japan, there are crises, but crises no longer have this powerful political effect. In short, counter-cyclical policies have significantly blunted the political potency of economic crises. Part of the reason that Barack Obama has had so much more difficulty than Franklin Roosevelt in getting his agenda passed after his sweeping electoral victory is that built-in counter-cyclical policies such as unemployment insurance, together with the emergency actions of both the Bush and Obama governments, that is, the stimulus package, financial bailouts, quantitative easing of the money supply, an extension of the length of unemployment insurance. All of these have blunted the force of the economic downturn. We Americans currently wring our hands about reaching 10% unemployment, right? This is the sort of unthinkable thing. But in 1933, 4 years after a similar financial meltdown, unemployment was over 25% nationally in the United States, and the jobless were generally drawing no unemployment benefits. Even in this age of supposedly triumphant neoliberalism, a sharp downturn like that of 2008 has actually resulted in only a modest mobilizing effect on political life. And indeed, it's not clear that the mobilizing has been more beneficial to the left than to the right in general. Up to now, I've been discussing how economic crises can combine contingently, you might say, with political events in such a way as to amplify disorder and thereby transform the political field, open up new possibilities, new political coalitions, and so on. In these cases, the key contingency that produces the transformative effect is actually exterior to the economic crisis as such. That is, it's in the realm of politics that the transformations take place. At this point in my lecture, I turn to the interior dynamics that produced the economic crises in the first place. My approach borrows heavily both from Marx and Joseph Schumpeter, both of whom were fascinated by economic crises, and both of whom saw them as inevitable features, indeed indissoluble ingredients of the capitalist economy. It's Marx who, in my opinion, best analyzes capitalism's inherent impetus toward endless accumulation, which of course leads to crises of overaccumulation. But I think it's Schumpeter who best anatomizes the necessarily cyclical rhythms of capital accumulation. The economic crisis, after all, is just one phase of the business cycle. The crisis is the moment when the upward thrust of economic activity ends and the downward spiral begins. Schumpeter insists that economic growth, or what Marx would call capital accumulation, is an inherently cyclical process, one that he sees as arising from a spiraling series of economic innovations. Economic progress, he writes, is not primarily the result of an increase in factors of production, but rather of applying existing factors of production to ever new ends and by ever-changing methods. Economic progress, in other words, is a consequence of entrepreneurial innovations that make what he calls new combinations of factors of production. But what does this emphasis on new combinations have to do with business cycles or economic crises? Schumpeter emphasizes that entrepreneurial new combinations are inherently discontinuous. Industrial and commercial change, as he puts it, is not continuously distributed in time, but rather proceeds by leaps. An industrial or commercial leap or breakthrough, whether it's the invention of James Watt's steam engine or the Bessemer process or Walmart's inventory system, this breakthrough results in huge profits for the successful entrepreneur. Each breakthrough also gives rise to related or complementary innovations. Innovations, Schumpeter points out, cluster densely together, so densely, in fact, that the resultant disturbance produces a distinct period of adjustment, which precisely is what the depression phase of the business cycle consists in. The up phase caused by the innovation thus necessarily gives rise to the down phase via an economic crisis. So what does he see as the mechanism of this? Schumpeter stresses that that entrepreneurial innovation of this sort could not happen without credit creation. The existing resources that are put into new combinations by innovating entrepreneurs must be removed from other uses, and this requires money to pry them loose, money that the entrepreneur rarely has in sufficient quantity without borrowing. And once the innovation has proved successful, both the initial entrepreneur and hordes of imitators find plenty of banks and individuals willing to extend credit to them by loans or purchases of stocks or bonds in hopes of sharing in the great bonanza of profits that the innovation brings about. Hence, successful innovations result in sizable bouts of credit creation, which is what imparts an upward thrust to the economy as a whole. But it's also inevitable that credit inflations are followed by credit deflations. Not all of the enterprises launched during the bonanza of easy credit will prove to be profitable. For example, the many firms attempting to crowd into an innovative and initially profitable line of economic activity will soon saturate the market, driving down prices and eliminating profits for all but the most efficient or the best capitalized firms. As losses begin to appear, creditors call in loans and sell stocks and bonds of the enterprises that appear shaky, reducing the firm's capital and eventually freezing credit markets. This fall in credit, as we have seen very clearly over the past year, of course causes a general decline in economic activity. In other words, Marx and Engels' epidemic of overproduction, which creates a state of momentary barbarism, is, according to Schumpeter, a guaranteed result of the initial successful leap of innovation. For Schumpeter, it is entrepreneurship that gives capitalism its dynamic thrust. He's the great sort of prophet of the entrepreneur. I've lost my place. The business cycle then is simply the business cycle is the determined path that the economy follows in seeking a new equilibrium once the old one has been disturbed by all of this successful innovation. None of this, it seems to me, is in any way inconsistent, or is very much inconsistent, at least, with the general outline of Marx's account, although a Marxist interpretation would surely lean much less on the entrepreneur's heroism. Of course, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels themselves heaped what seems like extravagant praise on the accomplishments of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, they say, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? What great prose these guys cranked out in that wonderful document. But a couple of pages earlier in the same text, Marx and Engels declare that this astoundingly creative bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without doing this. This, to me, implies that the creativity of the bourgeoisie must itself be seen as a product of the socio-economic relations in which entrepreneurs are enmeshed. It's not that the bourgeois are so intrinsically heroic or brilliant. Rather, the bourgeois, to remain a bourgeois in the highly competitive economic world that the bourgeoisie has created, must innovate in order to keep profits flowing. Failure to innovate will result in falling profits, business failure, and sliding downward from the bourgeoisie into the petty bourgeoisie or the proletariat. In a Marxian account of the Schumpeterian business cycle, the dynamic of capitalism as a system would require businessmen to search for new combinations, some of which will turn out to produce Schumpeter's forward leaps. One might say that, from this point of view, the successful entrepreneurship that sets off a business cycle should be regarded as, you might say, the statistically rare success that's bound to be generated randomly, given a very large number of trials. So everybody's trying to innovate. Some of these innovations are bound to work. Hence, we would have to amend Schumpeter's judgment in an important way. Just as the upswing and the downswing of the business cycle are necessarily generated out of the successful entrepreneurial innovation by the intrinsic dynamics of credit, so the search for innovation by would-be entrepreneurs is inevitably generated out of the continual downward pressure on profits, characteristic of a competitive economy, a downward pressure that is itself the product of the last round of innovation. The entrepreneurial breakthroughs, no less than the booms and the busts, are hence inevitable. They're actually constitutive of the capitalist economy. For Schumpeter, it's the unending repetition of this credit-mediated cycle of innovation leading to boom, leading to bust, that pushes the capitalist economy forward to ever higher levels of material wealth. But Schumpeter, no less than Marx, is aware that this endless accumulation is an extremely messy affair. The repeated ratcheting up of production over the ever-repeated business cycles results in what Schumpeter, in a brilliant oxymoronic turn of phrase, calls creative destruction. The economy, he says, grows by a process of industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. The process of creative destruction, he says, is the essential fact about capitalism. The creation, of course, thrives mainly in the upswing. The destruction, which results when strong, efficient, technologically innovative, and profitable firms drive the weak, inefficient, and technologically obsolete or unprofitable firms out of business, happens mainly in the crashes. From Schumpeter's point of view, business cycles are the mechanism by which the central generative process of capitalism, that is, creative destruction, is actually carried out. Now, in my previous work on events, I've defined the event as an interlocking sequence of happenings that durably transforms structures. So let's define economic events as sequences of happenings that take place within the economic field and that durably transform economies. I began this lecture with a question of economic crises, mainly because these crises, crashes, bank runs, bailouts, bubbles, panics, these are the most obvious and visible candidates for transformative economic events in capitalist economies. Moreover, as I have suggested above, such crises can sometimes have very important effects in politics. Economic crises can become, in effect, a catalyst for transformations of the political field. But with respect to the economic field itself, the hybrid Marxian Schumpeterian point of view that I have elaborated above makes these flamboyant and newsworthy crises seem rather less important than they at first appear. One might argue that crises are merely the points of inflection in an endless series of business cycles, and that for the dynamics of the economy, it's actually the cycle as a whole, not the crisis per se, that turns out to be the decisive unit of analysis. But here we return with a vengeance to our opening paradox. We can only count as transformative events can we count these as transformative events, these repetitive business cycles whose details are perhaps always new, but whose essential dynamics are unchanging? I think we're now in a position to address that question more effectively. If we ask the question at a very high level of abstraction, that is, if we look at the impact of economic cycles on the most fundamental or definitive structures of capitalism, I think the answer has to be that the succession of business cycles basically reproduces rather than transforms these structures. A disabused contemporary Marxist, that is, one who no longer expects a great crisis of capitalism to touch off a universal proletarian revolution, would presumably say that business cycles in no way challenge the primacy of the commodity form, nor do they alter in any fundamental way the process of realization of surplus value. And a Schumpeterian would say that business cycles perpetuate, indeed embody, the process of creative destruction, which is, after all, the essence of capitalism. Capitalism survives business cycles, even the most dramatic and crisis-ridden of these, with its central structures and dynamics renewed, not fundamentally transformed. Nor do crises cause capitalism to deviate from its underlying and very strongly directional historical dynamics. That is, the endless accumulation of capital and material wealth, the relentless expansion of its reach around the globe, and the equally relentless expansion of its logics into ever more aspects of human social relations. We should pause for a moment to note the extreme peculiarity of capitalism in this respect. It's hard to think of any other human institution that has combined such extraordinary dynamism with such stability in its core mechanisms, or with such persistent directionality amid the surface fluctuations. Whatever Marx's errors as a prophet, he was certainly right in his perception that even though capitalism was, like any other institutional complex, a product of the contingencies of human history, it was nevertheless a novel, unique, strange, and extraordinarily powerful institutional complex, one whose historical dynamics were both uniquely promising and uniquely threatening, and whose mechanisms and tendencies could not be understood without a dedicated and exacting analysis. Now that capitalism has spread to the entire world and increasingly invades virtually all of our social relations, it seems to me more important than ever to keep our historical or ethnographic distance from capitalism. That is, to recognize, as Marx did, its essential weirdness or uncanniness. What's weird about capitalism is its stillness at the core in the midst of absolutely constant churning change. On the one hand, capitalism constantly produces a plethora of events. Inventions, initial public offerings, bubbles, booms, bankruptcies, stock market crashes, currency devaluations. Indeed, capitalist temporality seems to be more eventful than the temporality of other aspects of life. You might say capitalism is a kind of machine especially constructed for the incessant production of events. Yet these events are also contained within the repetitive framework of the business cycle, constantly generating rising capital accumulation and material wealth by means of endless rounds of creative destruction. At the highest level of abstraction, then, business cycles do not function as events because they seem to be incapable of transforming capitalism's fundamental structures. Yet, if we examine business cycles at a somewhat lower level of abstraction, that is, looking for transformations within the limits imposed by the fundamental structures and dynamics of capitalism, cycles are very eventful indeed. As the agents of creative destruction, they power capitalism's endless accumulation, spatial expansion, and progressive penetration of daily life. But they do so in a way that is profoundly uneven and highly contingent, causing development to leap now this way and now that. Here it might be useful to return to Schumpeter's question of entrepreneurial innovation. A capitalist economy encompasses a multitude of different economic activities, from agriculture to automobiles to accounting to hairdressing, all linked together by monetary exchange and credit. Indeed, each of these industries or sectors has its subdivisions and subspecialties, and each of its subspecialties its various suppliers and markets across a wide range of geographical locations. There are consequently millions of potential points where entrepreneurs will have strong incentives to come up with new combinations in order to reap huge profits. It's actually impossible to predict ex ante where innovations will take place, what form they will assume, or what ramifications they will have in other sectors, industries, or subspecialties. Capitalism, in short, forms a field of multiple possibilities for money-making innovations, only some of which in a given time and place will be realized. Hence, as Marxian commentators have long emphasized, capitalist development is profoundly uneven. It proceeds in industry-specific and spatially specific spurts. It is these that drive the business cycle. The industrial and spatial locations of these spurts, I would insist, is actually contingent, not necessary, since it depends on which of the countless possible innovations actually occurs and which of them actually gets picked up and generalized. So there's a lot of contingency here. The contingency involved in these spatially and industrially uneven spurts of investment and production is, of course, not absolute. Given the configuration of the economic field at a given time, some innovations are more likely to occur than others, and of those that do occur, some are more likely than others to be financed or copied. The state of the multiform economic field at time A affects its state, the state it will assume at time B, which in turn affects the state it will have at time C, and so on. The sequence of uneven development of industries and regions, which is powered by successive business cycle generating growth spurts, has the quality that economic historians and sociologists call path dependency. The nature of such path dependency might be illustrated by giving an example that will surely be familiar to many of you. The successful innovation of cotton spinning machines in Lancashire in the years leading up to 1780 stimulated a series of innovation during the various economic cycles of the next 50 years or so, in the manufacture of machinery in Lancashire and elsewhere, in growing and ginning of cotton in the American South, in transatlantic shipping to carry all that cotton, in the development of mechanical looms to weave the suddenly cheap and abundant cotton yarns, in the mechanical printing of finished cloths, in the financial techniques of the Rothschild Bank and various imitators which thrived by financing the cotton trade, in the marketing of English cottons in India, which decimated the world's previously dominant producer, in the manufacture of steam engines, which were used to power the cotton mills, in the development of new forms of cloth retailing, in the development of mechanical spinning and weaving of other fibers such as linen, wool, and silk, in the mechanical manufacture of cotton and other fabrics and machines in France, Switzerland, Belgium, the United States, and Germany, and so on. None of these developments was strictly necessitated by the original innovations, but the likelihood of their occurrence was obviously increased by them. Thus, an initial breakthrough whose probability of occurrence had itself been raised but certainly not determined by previous developments had cascading effects that differentially affected various regions and industrial and commercial specialties. The sequence of cyclical bursts of investment and production that I've just sketched out should be familiar. It constituted what we usually call the Industrial Revolution, surely an economic event of the first order, one whose consequences eventually transformed societies all around the world. This example indicates that which new combinations actually occur in the enormous field of contingent possibilities, and which of them have sufficient ramifications to power business cycles can have immense consequences for the real evolution of economic institutions and indeed of whole societies. Thus, if cycles of creative destruction have certain very peculiar features, they certainly must be counted as economic events, as sequences of happenings that transform economic structures. But these are events with a temporal shape that's very different from that of political events, which have generally served as the template for thinking about events in general, and this includes my own work on theorizing events. Political events tend to have a highly punctual structure, marked by wars, revolutions, rebellions, coups d'etat, vast social movements, electoral reversals, treaties, changes of ministries. Quite distinct, relatively short temporalities there. Because states are organizations specifically structured to steer or govern societies, they're relatively centralized in form. This means that when the center is transformed by a political event, the fall of the Berlin Wall, say, the death of Louis XIV, the election of Margaret Thatcher. The effects will be felt quickly and widely within the state in question and beyond. States are also public institutions, which means that they are centers of publicity, of public discourse, both linguistic and visual. Political history, thus, has a succession of pretty clear turning points marked by well-known, highly publicized events to which political actors, political institutions, and public discourses necessarily respond. But this punctual quality is only exceptionally true of economic events. Economic crises, of course, are marked by dramatic and well-publicized moments. But the innovations or clusters of innovations that set off cycles of creative destruction are at first rarely publicized beyond the particular industry and location that's affected. The invention of the spinning jenny and the water frame, or for that matter, of mortgage securitization in the 1970s, happened more or less anonymously, without creating a public stir, even though their consequences turned out to be huge. Use of the spinning machines initially brought sharp local rises in profits in the spinning industry, of course, which encouraged an expansion of credit, at first locally and eventually through the entire British economy. And given that monetary exchange extended to all of Europe and beyond in the 18th and early 19th centuries, this local innovation could have effects on the availability of credit throughout the entire capitalist world system. Yet when building speculators in Philadelphia, for example, took advantage of abundant credit at low rates of interest, they probably hadn't the faintest idea that the initial source of this boon was a mechanical invention in far-off Lancashire. Whereas political events are publicly and rather garrulously transmitted, the peculiar, abstract, and universalistic semiotics of monetary exchange enable rapid but anonymous transmission of economic events over vast distances. What people are aware of is not an economic boom caused by a technological innovation in the English cotton industry, but rather a general loosening of credit, a surge of business confidence, and a rise in demand for their particular products, whatever those products might be. The event is not then shaped as a sharp and public happening that demands explicit responses from citizens and political institutions. Rather, it's shaped more like a wave that raises all boats as it passes and then lowers them again. The economic cycle, which I take to be the crucial form of the economic event within capitalism, thus has a rolling or wave-like rather than a punctual structure. Indeed, it seems to be structured as waves within waves. There are both long swells, as skeins of path-dependent innovations shape economic activity in new ways over the course of decades, and shorter classic business cycles, as individual clusters of innovations create booms that extend and eventually overextend credit, resulting in retractions of credit, sometimes full-scale crises, that eliminate the ill-adapted and the unlucky, thereby clearing the way for the next round of expansion. The temporality of the modern era, which I would define as identical to the capitalist era, is thus characterized by a complex and composite temporality, one that includes both the punctual and highly contingent time of political events and the wave-like and relentlessly expansive time of capitalist events. Since both types of temporality are at work in the same social formations, affecting in an overlapping fashion the perceptions, resources, and judgments of historical actors, it's obvious that capitalist and political temporalities can have combined effects. We've already seen that the superposition of a political crisis and an economic downturn could produce revolutions or major political transformations. It's also true that serious economic crises like the Great Depression could themselves produce crises in the states that were attempting to manage them. But the composite effects could be more organic as well, as when the long but very wavy British economic upsurge that constituted the Industrial Revolution greatly increased the economic resources of the British middle class and greatly concentrated, provoked, and strengthened the new urban working class as well, hence profoundly changing the nature of the British political game. A very different form of politics in 1780 and, say, 1840s. The long wave of the Industrial Revolution also propelled the British state to an international political and economic hegemony based on an ideology of free trade and a domination of both the oceans and high finance, which had a positive feedback, of course, on British industrial growth in turn. Likewise, states in the course of the 20th century attempted to intervene to dampen or even fend off economic cycles and assure full employment. Quite successfully, it appeared, during the 1950s and the 1960s. But even when capitalist dynamics and political dynamics are intertwined in various ways, which these are all examples of, it remains important to recognize the analytical independence and the causal autonomies of the different temporalities at work. Although my focus in this talk has been primarily theoretical, as I'm trying to figure out what these temporalities are, I think that sorting out capitalist from political temporalities is important for thinking clearly about the history of the past 300 or 400 years, and also about the present conjuncture. Now that the great political hopes that once inspired labor historians have faded with the shrinking of the industrial working class in the advanced countries, historians tend to deal with economic issues only when these impose themselves in a blatant kind of way on the story, as, say, in histories of the 1930s. You can't read a history of the 1930s that doesn't take into account the Great Depression. Yet it's arguable that the great historical fact about the modern world, at least since the mid-17th century, is that societies all around the world have been increasingly subjected to the novel temporal dynamic of capitalism, which has been characterized by endless accumulation of capital, increasing integration of the world's societies into capitalist logics of production and exchange, and waves within waves of ever-repeated but ever-different creative destruction. I would maintain that during this long historical period, it's the history of capitalism, actually, that provides the most comprehensive horizon for historical studies in general. If this is true, it implies that we need to figure out how to build the temporalities of capitalism more firmly and more explicitly into our histories. Now, here I want to be sure that I'm not misunderstood. I'm definitely not trying to revive the economic determinism and the teleology that were so widely shared by both Marxist and modernization theorists in the 1960s and the 1970s. I don't claim that economic interests or class interests explain developments in politics and culture in some single-directed way. And rather than seeing the history of capitalism as an ineluctable march toward a determinate goal by predictable means, toward either the classless society or the rationally managed utopia of the modernization theorists, I see capitalist temporality as characterized by what might be called the directionless directionality of accumulation for accumulation's sake, by a constant churning of creative destruction that propels economic, social, and cultural development in unforeseeable new directions, and keeps doing so, through the medium of waves within waves of formally repetitive but substantively novel transformations of patterns of production and exchange. Now, at this point, I would like to be able to lay out an agenda of the types of historical inquiries that I think follow from this view of the temporality of capitalism, but the truth is, I don't really have a worked out agenda yet. I'm just kind of putting together the picture of the temporality of capitalism on the fly. In fact, when I cast about for models, I find that I actually keep returning to that very old Marxist, Eric Hobsbawm, now over 90. His 4 volumes on the history of the long 19th and short 20th centuries, stretching from the age of revolution to the age of extremes, are, in my opinion, easily the greatest general histories written within the past half century. These books explicitly cast modern history as the history of capitalist society, never forgetting how the dynamism, restlessness, and expansive power of capitalism shapes, in contradictory and sometimes destructive ways, the politics and culture of the expanding European world. Hobsbawm has demonstrated to my satisfaction that taking world capitalism as the definitive horizon of modern history makes possible an uncommonly convincing form of historical synthesis. So the first thing I should say about my emerging historiographical agenda is that there are some important older models to draw on. If the best of the older generation never forgot about the centrality of capitalism to modern history, I also think the younger generation of historians who grew up under neoliberalism and globalization is currently returning to the study of capitalism as a form of life. At least this seems to be happening among graduate students I'm working with at Chicago. Here I'd like to mention 3 dissertations, 2 in progress and 1 recently defended, that take up aspects of what one might call the cultural history of capitalism. The first of these looks at the cultural history of risk in the United States from the 1830s to the 1930s, focusing mainly on futures markets and life insurance. The problem is to trace out how institutions, law, and popular attitudes came to terms with a society that's constantly exposed to the risks inherent in credit-mediated exchange and ever-renewed creative destruction. A second dissertation looks at legal norms and public discourse surrounding debt and bankruptcy in 19th century France. It traces the slow evolution from a legal regime of debt that treated bankruptcy as a matter of profound shame, one that deprived bankrupts of civil rights. If you were bankrupt, you couldn't vote, you couldn't hold office. It deprived bankrupts of civil rights, and it also could consign debtors to prison. It was a movement from this toward a legal regime that saw business failure simply as one of the constitutive hazards of capitalist society, and that placed no additional burdens on the bankrupt beyond the already punishing monetary loss. The third dissertation is a comparative study of economic and political discourse about finance in Germany and Britain, mainly in the 1920s and 1930s. It's well known that the Nazis violently denounced high finance, which they regarded as anti-national, perverse, and, of course, Jewish. Meanwhile, they praised industry, by contrast, as patriotic, productive, and German. But this same sense that finance was unproductive and perverse was, in fact, quite widespread among non-Nazi German economic thinkers as well, and among both right and left-wing cranks, but also serious economists in Britain. We should remember that Keynes himself joked about the need to euthanize the rentiers. The author of this thesis treats these views as ideological misrecognitions that assign the evil and disruptive aspects of capitalism exclusively to financiers, thus hiding from themselves the inherently disruptive character of modern capitalism tout court. These 3 dissertations, of course, constitute a small and biased sample. But I think they stand for a growing interest in the history of capitalism among the current generation of history graduate students, certainly by comparison with students working in the later 1980s and the 1990s. I also note that these 3 topics are very different from the topics taken up in the last great surge of interest in the history of economic life. That is, the studies of labor, peasant, and urban history that were so common in the 1960s and 1970s, and that I myself cut my teeth on. For the new generation, what seems most problematic and interesting about capitalism is not so much class oppression as it is the instabilities connected with credit and finance. Perhaps not surprisingly, given their life experiences, they're more attuned to the pathologies of creative destruction than to the agonies and joys of class struggle. Finally, it seems only fair to give 2-sentence descriptions of my own current work on the history of capitalism. There are 2 projects, both of which explore the effects of long swings of capitalist development on social imaginaries. So I haven't broken from cultural history. I'm just trying to put it into contact with a more thoroughly theorized economic history or history of capitalism. My main current project looks at how the long initial upswing of capitalism in France in the 18th century brought about changes in social experience, outlook, and categories of judgment and analysis, changes that helped to make a certain form of civil and political egalitarianism thinkable by the eve of the French Revolution. A second project looks at the transition in the 20th century from the great post-war boom of regulated capitalism in the 1950s and the 1960s to the volatile global neoliberalism of the period since. It attempts to chart the decline of a Fordist social imaginary, both in the oppositional culture of the later 1960s and in a different form in the upsurge of various identity-based movements in the 1970s. And finally, the triumph of a neoliberal social imaginary since the 1980s, trying to relate all of these to the slow decomposition of organized capitalism and the rise of hyper-competitive, financialized, and globalized capitalism. I offer these brief sketches of work underway, both mine and others, not to stake out a full historiographical or try to define a full historiographical agenda, but simply to illustrate something of the range of questions that a new focus on the dynamics and temporalities of capitalism might be capable of stimulating. In any case, I think that over the past decade or so, runaway capitalism has become the great issue of our times. I think it's time for historically minded scholars to grasp this issue and to wrestle with it. Thank you.
Thank you for a fabulous presentation, very thought-provoking as usual. I have 2 questions. One has to do with the narrative origin of your account of history of capitalism. And I will take as an example the Lancashire mills that you were talking about. You started your narration with the Lancashire mills and the impact of the mills themselves. Of course, that also affects the narration. The Lancashire mills, one could argue, was a consequence of a certain economic development rather than a cause. So how can one decide in such events as to what is a cause and what is a consequence? That is one question. And the other one also has to do with, of course, the spatial dimension of the same analysis. In the sense, if you look at the origins of how things end up in Lancashire in that context, one can argue that the machinery and other things come from the Mediterranean region up north, and also from elsewhere in China. So how do you sort of spatially that?
I think these are both very interesting questions. On the question of where to start, well, I think if you take the view of the dynamics of capitalism that I've been trying to sketch out here, it's actually quite arbitrary where you start, right? Yes, you could start in. You can start. I mean, I took that partly because that's an example that everyone can follow pretty easily, right? But one could start earlier. One could start later. It's not clear that there's any particular time that is a key originating moment. Instead, there's this kind of rolling temporality that's involved. So I don't think there's anything special about the invention of spinning technology in Lancashire as the origin of capitalism. By no means. Capitalism is already underway, and that then segues nicely, I think, into the second question, that is the spatial question. Of course, you know, in what industry did these happen? Well, this particular innovation happened in the cotton industry. Where did cotton get into Europe from? Mainly from India, actually. It was the Dutch who first started importing vast amounts of printed cottons into Europe in the second half of the 17th century. They became a huge, huge hit. They were very colorful. They were lighter and cheaper than other kinds of fabrics, than wool or silk. And they became extraordinarily stylish. And so it was actually the importation of this fabric that was already being made at a very high level, a high technical level in India by hand technology, but very fine cloth and very fine printing. That was that made for the possibility of this European breakthrough. Okay, so it's something. So where is the origin then? Well, is the origin in India? Yes and no. Is the origin in Europe? Yes and no. One of the places where the origin is in that fact of the link of the Dutch between India and Europe, which is then, of course, later taken over mainly by the English. So that there is always a spatial dynamic to this, and I think this is one of Marx's essential kind of definitions of what capitalism is about. Is that he says that it really begins with the great discoveries and the conquest of or the opening of new routes to Asia and the Americas. So that. Capitalism in that respect, always from the very beginning, has a kind of geopolitical aspect that is a part of it. I think, from my money, the person who's best analyzed this side of capitalism is probably Giovanni Arrighi in the long 20th century. Anyway, I think that's enough.
Sure, that'll be. Bill.
Yes.
I think, just segueing on what Muge said, it seems to me one of the this isn't what I'm going to really ask, but it seems to me one of the implied directions of that question is about the global context.
Yes.
And I had a similar thought when you invoked Hobsbawm, which is, as you know, I'm always happy to do. Because one of the critiques of Hobsbawm has been the Eurocentrism of that particular. So that's just really another thought about the last question. My question is about about politics and about the difficulties of crystallizing an understanding of political agency from how you were laying out the temporalities of capitalism, in contradistinction to how you've conceptualized, you've theorized the event in the context of political temporalities, where it's much easier and almost by definition.
Yes.
To see how, but also those political temporalities are always more firmly located in particular contexts of time and place within particular societies, you know, even allowing for the transferential effects of political events in one place on events in another. So it's much easier in how you theorize political temporalities to see where points of coherent, sort of organized political coalescence and political intervention can occur.
Yes.
Now it's much harder to see that, and maybe that's just the world we now live in, right? Much harder to see that when you are laying out the temporalities of capitalism. And in the examples that you gave, in the instances that you gave towards the very end of models of how we might, you know, now do history, it's really about effects, right?
Yeah. Risk,
credit, debt, and so on. So it's much easier to see how the eventfulness contained in the temporalities of capitalism can do things to people, right? Can do things to societies, so that have effects which then get processed. It's much harder to see how a political, organized political agency can coalesce in such a way as to enable political intervention to affect that process. Yeah. Right.
Yes, I think that's true. That is, I think, part of the problem of the capitalist economy, although I think, I don't think the capitalist economy has always been with us. I agree with Marx that it's something that happened at a certain point in time. But since the capitalist economy has been with us, it seems to have this inherent temporality, right? And therefore it throws off effects, and it's hard to knock off course. You try to knock it off course, and it then sort of returns to course. If you think of, say, the New Deal, that was basically a kind of saving of capitalism and bringing it in the end, brought things back to more or less where they had been. I agree that the easiest thing to work on is how societies, both culturally, intellectually, and politically, process these difficulties that capitalism causes to them. I agree that that's the most obvious thing. And I would say not just difficulties, but also opportunities. Because I think in the 18th century French case, there are actually some opportunities that are opened by capitalism. I mean, capitalism is a very complex affair, and one of the things it does, you might say, through the logic of the commodity, is make possible and real certain forms of equality or equivalence that are not characteristic of most pre-capitalist societies. So there is a potentially sort of positive side to that as well, and certainly I think people who experienced life under the Soviet regimes could see much that was liberating, right, about capitalism, and that's not just because they're naive. They actually are seeing something that is liberating. But part of the question is how does one work on the reverse of the that is the politics into the economy. I talked a little bit in here about one of those cases, which is the post-war settlement, basically. That was a case of, in the first place, of course, it was the great power was the United States. That was obvious, and the United States working together with other capitalist countries came up with a framework that effectively stabilized the economy relative to what it had been previously. But I shouldn't say that it's all the United States that did it, because quite obviously the British, by the end of the war, were ready to set up a welfare state. That was also a very important moment there. But I think you could see in that case, there was a political accomplishment worked out by ordinary political means, by treaties, by power politics, by parliamentary means, and so on, that actually had a very big effect on the economy for a considerable period of time. So it's not as if this can never happen, but it's difficult to do. The other case, which I've just talked about, just a couple of words dropped in, is the rise of neoliberalism. That was also not just an economic event, but very much a political event. Indeed, it seems to me that there was a real economic crisis that was a structural crisis in the 1970s. It's quite different from most upturns and downturns. In the 1970s, the downturns weren't particularly steep. They weren't the worst experienced. Yet those business cycles were the most difficult to handle, the most difficult for the politicians to make sense of, the most difficult to conquer by ordinary economic means. So it was a real crisis of the whole capitalist system, I think. And I think there was a great deal of contingency, actually, in the virtually simultaneous elections of Thatcher and Reagan in the two most powerful economies in the world. And that had that not happened, I'm not sure that we'd have seen at least the same brand of neoliberalism that we've seen. So I think there are points where politics makes a big difference for the particular flavor that capitalist development is going to take for its next round. The other thing, of course, is the importance of the hegemonic roles of the great hegemonic economic and political power. So there's an English era of capitalism. There's an American era of capitalism. We're probably not too far from a Chinese era of capitalism. Of course, before that, there was a Dutch era of capitalism. And these eras are geopolitical facts as much as they are economic facts. Anyway, I don't know whether that really answered the question, but yeah.
I have a comment and a question, Neil. Mm-hmm. The comment comes from something you said early on, where you said history has kind of given up on economic history and left it to the economists.
Yes.
Now you know that they refused to take it up. That it in fact has been the bastard child in the economics profession for at least 50 years now. And no matter how many reports come out from economists saying, oh, we ought to be teaching it more, it is taught less and less. So don't think that you can go to a modern economist and learn about economic history. I think you agree on that, right?
Yeah, and I would say in addition to that, what happened to economic history in this period of transition in between the 60s and the 80s is that it became purely the study of the past of economic growth and stagnation. The only question, essentially, that economic historians in economic departments were asking is what brings higher growth, what brings lower growth, how can we explain the decline of Britain or the rise of whatever. It's all about economic growth, whereas the earlier economic history that was done by historians as well wasn't just about economic growth. It was also about what I would call forms of economic life. So there's been, I think, something impoverishing about that turn to economics in economic history.
But the question I want to ask you has more to do with the political side of your analysis. And basically you said, well, there are really events there that punctuate things.
Yeah.
But the nature of those events, sometimes they're so large and massive that we can all see them.
Right. World War I, you can't.
Right.
You can't miss.
You therefore see the role of international politics in big events. But there's, in political science, as you know, there's this big debate. I think it's now a small debate, but it was a big debate, where there are such things as critical elections.
Yes.
And that literature gives more, if you believed it. And you know, I'm saying this because you can get political scientists to argue both sides of that case, and I don't think a consensus has emerged in 50 years of discussion of that issue. If you thought that that was a useful approach, that would give you periods of actually close to what you're getting on your descriptive level, the era of neoliberalism, the coalition of the critical political election that then led to a stability in the party system and the party agenda that then would get challenged. You could see the challenges coming up, and then you would see a new period coming in if that theory were right. Just a comment and kind of a question.
Yes, I agree. I've always found that a rather interesting. I mean, as a historian, it's much more historical than what most political scientists do. And of course, it's a cyclical theory. I'm not sure whether I really quite buy the cyclical stuff, but I do think there are, you know, certainly in the history, in American history, there are a series of different party systems, and the party systems are relatively stable for certain periods of time. So you might argue that there are, there are some kinds of political processes in certain kinds of states where you have something that's similar to a cycle. I agree, it's good to think about.
Thank you. Bill, this was so stimulating, I didn't know where to begin, but I want to begin at the very end of your talk when you, maybe it was just a throwaway line, referred to runaway capitalism.
Yeah.
So it got me wondering, what is capitalism running away from? And I thought, political regulation, but then I remembered your waves and cycles. And so I wondered whether, I don't know if I can do this with my hand or, or my words, but are the waves on the same plane? Or do we have waves that are ascending in some fashion?
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, when you responded to Jeff's question by citing the post-war conjuncture of welfare stateism, what you left out was the Hobsbawmian point about the Soviet Union acting as a cautionary factor.
Well, as in some ways the motivator for keeping that coalition together.
Right.
And that policy in place.
And then it reminded me of the 1 billion people you talked about at the beginning of your talk that don't have the Soviet Union. But in other words, where is the other in the late 20th and into the 21st century?
Right. Well, I think it's getting harder and harder to see any other. I mean, you might say that prior to, say, World War I, right, the Russian Revolution, there was both a posited other of socialism, and there was also a real other, that is, of societies that were either pretty thoroughly outside of capitalism, right, studied by ethnographers, for example, or that were only partially integrated into capitalism, or integrated only in portions of their social relations. That latter kind of other seems to have passed away, right? I mean, that's a historical fact, and we read the great ethnographies of the first, say, 60 years of the 20th century, essentially as a form of history. And it's a rather sad form of history because those societies, for the most part, just don't exist anymore. So that kind of other it seems to me, is quite completely gone. So it is increasingly, I mean, one of the things that makes capitalism, whether runaway is the right word or not, I'm not sure. Certainly contemporary capitalism has been running away from political regulation, yes. Polanyi argues that in the era of the Industrial Revolution, the capitalist economy was running away from and stamping out various kinds of social regulations that were built into various instances of social life, including the state. So there's a sense in which capitalism is involved in an ever-present but always changing struggle with attempts to regulate it. And I think that's what one has to take away from Polanyi in the end. I don't know if I probably haven't answered more than a fraction of what you said, but anyway, on to the next.
Yeah, hi. This is probably a simple question in many regards, but we talk about capitalism as this one grand, almost transhistorical, ahistorical, atemporal entity. And I wonder, I mean, there's certainly within the logic of the economic field a powerful reason to talk about it, because of course that's part of what gives the logic of the analysis of capitalism its particular saliency, so you can talk about just something that exists as the same thing in all times and all places and is either emergent or not, but nevertheless once they're there. But from an analytical point of view, especially from someone who's also been worried about the specificities of place and contingency, I wonder whether it would be possible to also think about capitalisms with a plural, not as this big entity, but as thing that's defined perhaps by sector, by is agrarian capitalism in its various forms the same thing as industrial capitalism, as financial capitalism? Is it the same in one part of the world as another? Is it the same in one period of time? And if we begin to disaggregate those and then look, in fact, for some of the mechanisms, for instance, finance is one thing that tries to create consistencies across various kinds of markets between various forms.
Yeah, it's the great mediation.
Is that one of the ways then, but of retexturing and trying to, because part of the story is around the monolith nature, and in fact, if we demonolithize it, if that makes sense, do we then begin to get a different sense both of its kinds of temporalities, of places where it grabs and places where it doesn't?
I think that's a very important suggestion. I didn't start out my adult life as a Marxist at all, but I find that Marx and Marxism has grown on me over time, and this is this view of capitalism that I've been giving, I think, is it's basically a kind of Marxian notion of what capitalism is like. I think that of course there are varieties. I mean, everyone. There's a very famous book in political science and political sociology called "Varieties of Capitalism" by Peter Hall and David Soskus, that argues that among the advanced capitalist economies there are really two quite different models. One is I forget what they call it, but a kind of controlled capitalism, and the other is liberal capitalism. It's basically the European model and the various Anglos models. That is not only the United States but also Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and England. And they argue that these are both, it's not clear that either one of them is more advanced or more successful than the other in terms of generating profits. Yet they have some real persistence over a long period of time, and the way that they deal with anything that sort of perturbs the existing equilibrium is in terms of the distinctive systems that they've already set up. So there is a model out there, I think, in that, and that's become a kind of more than a cottage industry, really a kind of growth industry in political science and sociology that looks at questions of the economy. I certainly think that there are a lot of variations. At the same time, while there are variations, I also think that there's something uncannily similar about all of these forms of capitalism. There's something about this basic dynamic of surplus extraction, of the universal interchangeability of all values. That is, and of the consequent continued expansion that seems to be characteristic of capitalism more or less wherever you find it, whatever flavor it has. Yes, there are variations, and there can be, if you look at the variations, I mean, if you look at, for example, if you look at health outcomes, and you compare, say, Scandinavian countries to the U.S. and the other Anglo economies, health outcomes are much better in the Scandinavian system than in the U.S. system. So there are various kinds of differences that are quite substantial. So it can matter quite a lot what it is that becomes the dominant model. And it's, of course, the Anglo-American model that has become dominant and that is now, I think, in quite serious crisis and may indeed not survive as the dominant model.
You talked a lot about the relationship between Marx and Schumpeter having similar ideas of crises as being somewhat endemic to capitalism.
Right.
They also shared the idea that capitalism might not last very long. Schumpeter was highly pessimistic that capitalism would last much longer, but for different reasons. And that's the thing I wanted to ask you. Because for Marx, and I'm thinking the long way, I'm thinking of Ernest Mandel and his suggestion that capitalism only works because of exogenous factors. That it has to be something outside of the economy that makes it continue to work because it's inherently flawed. Whereas Schumpeter thinks it works just great, that it's completely compatible with society. And it's the politics that are threatening, the political event being the rise of socialism, I think we put it in the terms that you suggest. And so my question then is does that matter? Do you think that these two different perspectives give us different ways of gauging whether or not the political event is important, being that for one person it's a threat and the other it's salvation?
Right. I mean, they have. It's a very interesting comparison, Schumpeter and Marx, because I mean, obviously, Schumpeter has read Marx and very seriously. I'm sure he derives much of his thinking from Marx, and particularly his thinking about the role of business cycles. But it's interesting that as early as the 1920s. Schumpeter is convinced that capitalism is going to go away, right? Why is it going to go away? Well, he has a theory of capitalism that centers on the entrepreneur, and his notion is that with the trustification, is his word in the 20s, of economic life, that is, trusts. Big corporations and so on, that this is going to lead to a kind of bureaucratic stultification. And the consequence will be that there won't be the great entrepreneurs who will be able to produce these things, because these are huge powerful economic entities. So what he thought was going to happen was that the economy, the dynamism of the economy would slow, and through this bureaucratization, and that we were going to enter a steady state, right? So he thought actually that capitalism, as he knew it and loved it, was a goner. Right, almost as much as Marx thought it was, although he had a very different notion of how it would come about. Anyway, no, I'm not too worried about the fact that they have very different politics. One of them is pro-capitalism, the other is anti-capitalism. One's for the working class, the other's for the entrepreneur. But in terms of the way their theories work, I think they're wonderfully complementary. I think it's possible to take aspects of these things out of the politics of their own particular politics.
I am wondering about a couple of things I think have to do with what this all means for yours and for our historiographic scholarly praxis. And perhaps to take up another term of yours, varieties of structures, perhaps. And I'm wondering, I was listening to other questions, there were a number of them that kind of presented this notion that there are two sides to your talk, ultimately, right? The political side and the economic side.
Yeah.
And I guess I wanted to invite you to reflect on how comfortable you are with that idea. I think first, in the context of sort of thinking about your own theorization of the event, right, which is kind of where we started.
Yeah.
So what does it mean then, this question that you raised, but I don't think you answered, to try to talk about economic events, as it were, using this category, events of durable transformations of structures, and we have a variety of structure that's defined precisely by the intense change around the fundamental similarity. Do we need to think in terms of varieties of events, or is this something you can theorize? And I think relatedly, when you presented the historiographic part agenda, or almost agenda, in any case, the work that you talked about, your own and the three dissertations, we're interested in that sense of cultural effects, right? But in any case, in mediating, right, and trying to articulate the relationship, or examine how these different structures articulate with one another, right? And I'm wondering if you could give us a better sense of how you might talk in a non-contingent fashion about changes at the level of cultural structures or forms of consciousness, changes at the level of economic structures. I mean, in your response to Jeff, for instance, just to give you a quick example, that notion of kind of economic structures providing a political opportunity structure in which then contingent politics can leap in and say, great, we've got a post-war settlement. Seems to imply a very different sort of scholarship than talking about what a Fordist imaginary might look like. I guess to distinguish those two different ways that you rendered that project. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about that as well.
Right, I was afraid somebody was going to ask me that question. Partly because I haven't really worked this all out, either for my own scholarship or for what I think is the appropriate agenda. I am convinced as I work on this, I'm convinced that that the temporalities of capitalism are really different from the temporalities of politics. That they have different kinds of logics, they have different kinds of rhythms, and I take that. I mean, I may be wrong, but I take that as being something that I see out there as I try to make sense of the world, both in the present and in the past. If that's the case, then as historians, one of the things we have to do is not sweep that fact under the rug and continue to try to talk about the kind of political temporalities that we're much more comfortable with, but rather try to figure out what kinds of articulations there are between these different forms of temporalities. So that I can say. I'm very much I was very conscious as I was, reading my, as I was writing my conclusion here, that particularly my 18th century project doesn't talk about economic fluctuations. I haven't put that into the project at all yet. So I can't say what role economic fluctuations have in it. So that's a question that's posed to me, and that I'm now going to have to go back and think about. And the thinking I've been doing about the post-war world, there I think it's easier to see how. What I'm interested in is what seems to me a real sort of sea change in social imaginary, right? In which the entrepreneur figures in a very important way, right? A story I like to tell that illustrates this is that there used to be an economic history journal that was called the Journal of Entrepreneurial History. When I started graduate school, I'd never heard of this thing, and somebody mentioned it, and I thought, what the hell is that? Because I'd actually not heard the word entrepreneur before. This was in 1962, okay? I think it wasn't just that I was such an ignorant rube, although, of course, we all, looking back on ourselves at that time, see ourselves as ignorant rubes. It's interesting that journal changed its title. It was the Explorations in Entrepreneurial History. And I need to figure out when it was that this happened, but I think it was probably in the 1970s that it changed its title to Explorations in Economic History. And within about 5 years of the time they changed their title, entrepreneurship became all the rage, so they blew it, right? Certainly anybody now, beginning graduate school, coming upon something called a Journal of Entrepreneurial, Explorations in Entrepreneurial History, would not be put off by the title, right? So entrepreneurship as an ideal, as a metaphor for talking about all kinds of agency, it permeates contemporary society, right? But it was absent before sometime in the later 1970s. You just didn't hear it, unless you were, running around with Milton Friedman, I suppose. So that's an example of a change that's clearly linked to this period of the 1970s and the sort of strange undecidability of that era, which I experienced. I can feel that one in my gut. On many fronts, it was not the most enjoyable, but the most fascinating decade that I lived through, I think, historically speaking. Anyway, so I really, quite honestly, I haven't worked out for my own work or for historiography as a whole what kinds of work people should be doing. What I was trying to do in this lecture for myself and also hopefully for you was to try to give a sense of why I think there's an important problem there. I'm afraid I don't have a solution for it.
All right, so let's thank Bill Sewell for a great talk. And